Hello, everyone. Hello, book lovers. Welcome to session 2 of the guided reading of Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey. Welcome back. I hope you've enjoyed listening or watching session 1. In session 1, I gave you an overview of the novel. We talked about Anne Brontë and the context of publication of Agnes Grey, and we read together and talked about chapter 1. Today, we're going to read together chapters 2 and 3, but as usual in our guided reading sessions, before we do that, we're going to catch up, we're going to refresh our memories, and let's talk about what happened in chapter 1. So chapter 1 is called The Parsonage. And in this chapter, we get an overview of our main character, the titular, Agnes Grey, right? It's a first-person narrative. So from the very beginning, we know that it's Agnes herself who's telling the story. For instance, she says, "Whether this be the case with my history or not, I am hardly competent to judge." So it's a first-person narrative. Agnes Grey is the narrator, and she tells us a bit about her family's history. So in chapter 1, we find out about her father and mother. So her father was a clergyman, middle-class man, and her mother came from an affluent family, but she fell in love with Mr. Grey, so she gave up her fortune to marry for love, which was something quite unusual at the time, right? To marry for love. Marriage was pretty much a business transaction, but because she decided to marry for love and to marry someone her family did not accept, she had to give up her fortune, which meant that Agnes's mother and father were living in, well, not very good financial condition, middle-class living, but not the same lifestyle that her mother was used to. And Agnes was the youngest of 6 children, but out of these 6 children, only 2 survived, she and her sister Mary. And here we already find some autobiographical echoes. This is, of course, Agnes Grey is fiction, but last time we talked about Anne Bronte's life and the tragic story of the Brontes. So we know that the Bronte sisters, the ones we know of, Anne, Emily, and Charlotte, they had a brother, Patrick Branwell. The 4 of them survived into adulthood, but they had 2 other sisters, Maria and Elizabeth. And these 2 girls, they died at the age of 10 and 11 when they were sent to school and they caught tuberculosis at school. There was an outbreak and a lot of children died, which unfortunately was not an exceptional case. That used to happen, these outbreaks of illnesses in schools or institutions. The hygiene conditions and the living conditions were not that good. So the 2 eldest Bronte sisters died, and they were then 6 in total, right? In Agnes Grey, it's the other way around. There are 6 siblings, but only 2 survived. Agnes and Mary, and the name Mary, of course, evokes Maria, and Agnes, perhaps Elizabeth. So that's an interesting parallel, right? But talking about Agnes Grey, so the fictional character, as the youngest, she was spoiled. She was the pet of the family. She was not used to working. She didn't learn any useful skills to earn money on her own, right? But her father, he wanted to make more money to be able to provide more for his family. He always felt guilty for taking his wife out of her family, out of the comfort of her family, and for being the reason why she gave up her fortune. So he wanted to find a way to make more money. So He met a merchant who was going to do some transactions overseas and make a lot of money. So he decided to bet on that. But it was a failed speculation business. The ship on the way back shipwrecked, so he lost all the money he had invested in. The merchant even died in this accident. So the family was in even more serious financial problems. They had to save more money, so they had to change their lifestyle even more drastically. And Agnes really wanted to help, but her family was like, well, you don't need to worry about this. This is not something you should worry about. And there's nothing you can do, honey. But she felt the need to contribute, right? So she comes up with a plan to become a governess. In the beginning, the family did not accept the plan. They left it off, didn't take it seriously, said it was not necessary, but she was persistent in this plan, in this dream, what became a dream. She wanted to prove that she was capable of taking care of herself, taking care of others, because as a governess, she would take care of other children, and of being able to bring some money home. Eventually, the family accepts. And the very end of chapter 1, it's very moving, bittersweet parting from home. So it is bittersweet because on the one hand, she's excited to see the world. She had lived in isolation. She didn't know much of the world outside her house and family circles. So she was excited to see the world and to be independent. But on the other hand, she was quite sad to let go of her childhood home, let go of her family, say goodbye to her sister. That was a very moving part. They both cried in the bedroom, knowing that that would perhaps be the last time that they would sleep together in the same bedroom as sisters, right? And to leave behind the comfort of childhood, that is a very important milestone in her life. And leaving home, she would leave childhood behind and embrace adulthood. And that is, of course, very significant moment in everyone's lives. You can probably relate to that. And that's where we left off, where Agnes was leaving home. So today we're going to read chapters 2 and 3. And just as a reminder, so I told you last time that I'm creating this new course on the Brontë sisters. If you're interested to study them in more depth, to know more about their legacy, their writing style, stay tuned. And if you want to know what other literary courses and workshops that are available for you at Books and Culture, you can visit the website booksandculture.club. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at books.and.culture, so you can stay up to date with all the wonderful, fascinating literary adventures that we offer at Books and Culture. All right, so let's read together chapter 2, First Lessons in the Art of Instruction. As we drove along, my spirits revived again, and I turned with pleasure to the contemplation of the new life upon which I was entering. But though it was not far past the middle of September, the heavy clouds and strong northeasterly wind combined to render the day extremely cold and dreary, and the journey seemed a very long one. For, as Smith observed, the roads were very heavy, and certainly his horse was very heavy too. It crawled up the hills and crept down them, and only condescended to shake its sides in a trot, where the road was at a dead level or a very gentle slope, which was rarely the case in those rugged regions. So that it was nearly 1 o'clock before we reached the place of our destination. Emotional landscape. Here's my first parenthesis. Emotional landscape is something very relevant in the Bronte's writing. So you see that she left her home behind, and as she enters her new life, the weather is cold, it's dreary, it's windy. So, what does it forecast? What do you think her life will be like in this new place based on the weather, right? So, the weather, the landscape, the outside world mirrors what is going on in the character's mind. So, the sadness of leaving home behind, and also foreshadows what is about to come. It's not a sunny day, it's not a bright morning full of hope and foreshadowing good things to come, but it's dreary, windy, and cold. So think about it. Yet, after all, when we entered the lofty iron gateway, when we drove softly up the smooth, well-rowed carriage road, with the green lawn on each side, studded with young trees, and approached the new but stately mansion of Wellwood, rising above its mushroom poplar groves, my heart failed me, and I wished it were a mile or two farther off. For the first time in my life, I must stand alone. There was no retreating now. I must enter that house and introduce myself among its strange inhabitants. But how was it to be done? True, I was near 19, but thanks to my retired life and the protecting care of my mother and sister, I well knew that many a girl of 15 or under was gifted with a more womanly address and greater ease and self-possession than I was. Yet, if Mrs. Bloomfield were a kind, motherly woman, I might do very well after all. And the children, of course, I should soon be at ease with them. And Mr. Bloomfield, I hoped, I should have but little to do with. Now, there is an interesting footnote here about the name of the mansion, Wellwood, right? A new stately mansion of Wellwood. Let's see what it says here. That's why it's important to have an academic edition with annotations and footnotes, because it really enriches your experience. So here it says, okay, Wellwood. The words young and new suggest the nouveau riche status of the Bloomfields. There existed a class distinction during the Victorian era between those who had recently earned their wealth and those who had inherited their wealth and consequently higher status. So the landed aristocracy, those that were born into a noble family and owned land, were in the highest level of society, right? But now, after the Industrial Revolution, especially, there were people who were making money with business, right? They were not born into a wealthy family or a landed family, someone in a family that owned land, but they were able to purchase land and to build their own mansions. So these were not hundreds years old, like those properties and state mansions of those very ancient noble families, but they were nonetheless rich, wealthy families. But they were not the same. There was a clear social distinction in rank. So by the way that Agnes describes the house of the Bloomfields, its new stately mansion, it gives the idea that the family, the Bloomfields, were not an ancient landed part of an ancient landed aristocracy, but a nouveau riche, a family that made their fortune with business. All right, and that's the family who hired them as a governess, right? Okay, let's continue. Be calm, whatever happens, I said within myself. And truly I kept this resolution so well and was so fully occupied in steadying my nerves and stilling the rebellious flutter of my heart that when I was admitted into the hall and ushered into the presence of Mrs. Bloomfield, I almost forgot to answer her polite salutation. And if it afterwards struck me that the little I did say was spoken in the tone of one half dead or half asleep. The lady, too, was somewhat chilly in her manner, as I discovered when I had time to reflect. She was a tall, spare, stately woman with thick black hair, cold gray eyes, and extremely sallow complexion. That's Mrs. Bloomfield. With due politeness, however, she showed me my bedroom and left me there to take a little refreshment. I was somewhat dismayed at my appearance on looking in the glass. The cold wind had swelled and reddened my hands, uncurled and entangled my hair, and dyed my face of a pale purple. Add to this, my collar was horridly crumpled, my frock splashed with mud, my feet clad in stout new boots, and as the trunks were not brought up, there was no remedy. So having smoothed my hair as well as I could, and repeatedly twitched my obdurate collar, I proceeded to clump down the 2 flights of stairs, philosophizing as I went, and with some difficulty found my way into the room where Mrs. Bloomfield awaited me. Now, this is interesting that she looks in the glass, so she looks in the mirror, and she was dismayed at her appearance, and it's a kind of a new self, kind of a stranger to her at this point. As she looks at herself in the mirror, she does not recognize her past self, but it's a new, strange self to her, disheveled, um, swelled and reddened hands because of the wind, and what else? The collar was horridly crumpled. The frock was splashed with mud. It's a new her, right? She led me into the dining room where the family luncheon had been laid out. Some beefsteaks and half-cold potatoes were set before me, and while I dined upon these, she sat opposite, watching me, as I thought, and endeavoring to sustain something like a conversation, consisting chiefly of a succession of commonplace remarks, expressed with frigid formality. But this might be more my fault than hers, for I really could not converse. In fact, my attention was almost wholly absorbed in my dinner, not from ravenous appetite, but from distress at the toughness of the beefsteaks and the numbness of my hands, almost palsied by their 5 hours' exposure to the bitter wind. I would gladly have eaten the potatoes and let the meat alone, but having got a large piece of the latter onto my plate, I could not be so impolite as to leave it. So, after many awkward and unsuccessful attempts to cut it with the knife, or tear it with the fork, or pull it asunder between them, sensible that the awful lady was a spectator to the whole transaction, I at last desperately grasped the knife and fork in my fists like a child of 2 years old, and fell to work with all the little strength I possessed. But this needed some apology. With a feeble attempt at a laugh, I said, "My hands are so benumbed with the cold that I can scarcely handle my knife and fork." "I dare say you would find it cold," replied she with a cool, immutable gravity that did not serve to reassure me. When the ceremony was concluded, she led me into the sitting room again, where she rung and sent for the children. "You will find them not very far advanced in their attainments," said she, "for I have had so little time to attend to their education myself, and we have thought them too young for a governess till now. But I think they are clever children, and very apt to learn, especially the little boy. He is, I think, the flower of the flock, a generous, noble-spirited boy, one to be led but not driven, and remarkable for always speaking the truth. He seems to scorn deception." This was good news. "His sister Mary Ann will require watching," continued she, "but she is a very good girl upon the whole, though I wish her to be kept out of the nursery as much as possible, as she is now almost 6 years old and might acquire bad habits from the nurses. I have ordered her crib to be placed in your room, and if you will be so kind as to overlook her washing and dressing and take charge of her clothes, she need have nothing further to do with the nursery maid." So there are different children, different ages. The young ones stay in the nursery with the maids, the nurses, I mean, with the nursemaids. And the older children spend time in a separate part of the house to study. And now, with the guidance of the governess, that's her, and see what else is part of her responsibilities: to wash and dress the 6-year-old, and to have her crib placed in her own room, so she would sleep in the governess's room. So that's quite a lot of work, right? Full time, 24/7. She would need to take care of at least the Marianne, the 6-year-old. And here's also an interesting footnote about the bad habits that could be gotten from the nurses. It's number 3. Let's take a look. One of the reasons governesses were employed was to teach the children socially correct deportment, manners, speaking habits, and accent, all of which the governess's middle-class background would enable her to do. A nurse, or round-the-clock day care provider, typically hailed from the working classes and would not have had the experience to enable her to teach these skills. The reference to bad habits also reflects the belief, typical of many members of the middle and upper classes, that the working classes suffered from an inherent lack of morality. So now that the child is older, 6 years old, she should not spend too much time at the nursery because she would be badly influenced by the maids, the nursemaids, the nurses, who would not speak in proper English and would have loose morals, as was as the lower classes were believed to have. So you see the prejudice here, right? So there's very strict social ranks, and the governess is this in-between person, right? So she comes from a more educated upbringing than the nurses. So she has the knowledge, the language skills, the moral education to teach the children and to bring them up in life and closer to what was expected from the upper class, right? So let's see what these children look like. From what we can tell by Mrs. Bloomfield, the mother, is that they haven't had much education till now, that they only thought it was necessary to have a governess at this point in their lives, which is quite late. So remember, they are a nouveau riche family, so perhaps it's only now that they have the money to afford that. And they also remember in chapter 1 we read that they're going to pay her very little. So education was most likely not in their priorities. And she says but she thinks the kids are smart, especially the boy is very clever and he always tells the truth. All right. I replied I was quite willing to do so, and at that moment my young pupils entered the apartment with their 2 younger sisters. Master Tom Bloomfield was a well-grown boy of 7, with a somewhat wiry frame, flaxen hair, blue eyes, small turned-up nose, and fair complexion. Marianne was a tall girl, too, somewhat dark like her mother, but with a round, full face and a high color in her cheeks. The second sister was Fanny, a very pretty little girl. Mrs. Bloomfield assured me she was a remarkably gentle child and required encouragement. She had not learned anything yet, but in a few days she would be 4 years old, and then she might take her first lesson in the alphabet and be promoted to the schoolroom, from the nursery to the school. The remaining one was Harriet, a little broad, fat, merry, playful thing of scarcely 2 that I coveted more than all the rest, but with her I had nothing to do. I talked to my little pupils as well as I could and tried to render myself agreeable, but with little success, I fear, for their mother's presence kept me under an unpleasant restraint. They, however, were remarkably free from shyness. They seemed bold, lively children, and I hoped I should soon be on friendly terms with them, the little boy especially, of whom I had heard such a favorable character from his mamma. In Marianne there was a certain affected simper and a craving for notice that I was sorry to observe. But her brother claimed all my attention to himself. He stood bolt upright between me and the fire, with his hands behind his back, talking away like an orator, occasionally interrupting his discourse with a sharp reproof to his sisters when they made too much noise. "Oh, Tom, what a darling you are!" exclaimed his mother. Come and kiss dear Mamma, and then won't you show Miss Grey your schoolroom and your nice new books? I won't kiss you, Mamma, but I will show Miss Grey my schoolroom and my new books. And my schoolroom and my new books, Tom, said Marianne. They're mine too. They're mine, replied he decisively. Come along, Miss Grey, I'll escort you. When the room and books had been shown, with some bickerings between the brother and sister that I did my utmost to appease or mitigate, Marianne brought me her doll and began to be very loquacious on the subject of its fine clothes, its bed, its chest of drawers, and other appurtenances. But Tom told her to hold her clamor that Miss Grey might see his rocking horse, which with a most important bustle he dragged forth from its corner into the middle of the room, loudly calling on me to attend to it. Then, ordering his sister to hold the reins, he mounted and made me stand for 10 minutes, watching how manfully he used his whip and spurs. Meantime, however, I admired Marianne's pretty doll and all its possessions, and then told Master Tom he was a capital rider, but I hoped he would not use his whip and spurs so much when he rode a real pony. Oh, yes, I will, said he, laying on with redoubled ardor. I'll cut into him like smoke. My word, but he shall sweat for it. This was very shocking, but I hoped in time to be able to work a reformation. Now, this first encounter with the kids is quite telling. So they don't have much education, but they're not shy kids. On the contrary, they're bold. They want notice from their governess. So especially the two oldest ones, Tom and Marianne, are constantly fighting for Agnes's attention, for the governess's attention. And Agnes brings her doll to show, and Tom brings his horse. And for 10 minutes, the governess has to watch him ride the horse and to use his whip and spurs, and very violently on the wooden horse. And when she says that she would hope that he would not do the same on a real horse, she was shocked to learn that he said he would indeed, and even harder. So what can you tell from Tom's personality from this very beginning, right? A show off, someone who wants attention all the time, and who is quite aggressive, who's not afraid to use force in order to get what he wants, right? Now you must put on your bonnet and shawl, said the little hero, and I'll show you my garden. And mine, said Marianne. Tom lifted his fist with a menacing gesture. She uttered a loud, shrill scream, ran to the other side of me, and made a face at him. Surely, Tom, you would not strike your sister. I hope I shall never see you do that. You will sometimes. I'm obliged to do it now and then to keep her in order. But it's not your business to keep her in order, you know. That is for, well, now go and put on your bonnet. It's a 7-year-old boy. See how he is bossy. So he orders the governess around, and not, she should be the one giving orders, but in fact, it's him who gives her orders. And he's quite aggressive with his little sister because he thinks it's his job to keep her in the right place. So he tells her to put her on her bonnet. I don't know. It is so very cloudy and cold. It seems likely to rain, and you know I have had a long drive. No matter, you must come. I shall allow of no excuses, replied the consequential little gentleman. And as it was the first day of our acquaintance, I thought I might as well indulge him. It was too cold for Marianne to venture out, so she stayed with her mamma, to the great relief of her brother, who liked to have me all to himself. The garden was a large one, and tastefully laid out. Besides several splendid dahlias, there were some other fine flowers still in bloom. But my companion would not give me time to examine them. I must go with him across the wet grass to a remote sequestered corner, the most important place in the grounds, because it contained his garden. There were 2 round beds stocked with a variety of plants. In one there was a pretty little rose tree, I paused to admire its lovely blossoms. "Oh, never mind that," said he contemptuously. "That's only Mary Ann's garden. Look, this is mine." After I had observed every flower and listened to a disquisition on every plant, I was permitted to depart. But first, with great pomp, he plucked a polyanthus and presented it to me, as one conferring a prodigious favor. I observed on the grass about his garden certain apparatus of sticks and cord, and asked what they were. "Traps for birds." "Why do you catch them?" "Papa says they can do harm." "And what do you do with them when you catch them?" "Oh, different things. Sometimes I give them to the cat, sometimes I cut them in pieces with my penknife, but the next I mean to roast alive." Can you believe that? Words coming out of a 7-year-old boy. "And why do you mean to do such horrible things?" "For 2 reasons. First, to see how long it will live, and then to see what it will taste like." "But don't you know that it's extremely wicked to do such things? Remember, the birds can feel as well as you, and think, how would you like it yourself?" "Oh, that's nothing. I'm not a bird, and I can't feel what I do to them." "But you will have to feel it sometime, Tom. You have heard where wicked people go to when they die. And if you don't leave off torturing innocent birds, remember, you will have to go there and suffer just what you have made them suffer." And here she's referring to hell, right? So the belief that whatever he did to others, even birds, even animals, the same would be done to him in hell. So he would suffer the consequences of his actions. But the boy says, "Oh, poof, I shan't. Papa knows how I treat them, and he never blames me for it. He says it's just what he used to do when he was a boy. Last summer he gave me a nest full of young sparrows, and he saw me pulling off their legs and wings and heads, and never said anything, except that they were nasty things, and I must not let them soil my trousers. And Uncle Robson was there too, and he laughed and said I was a fine boy." "But what would your mamma say?" "Oh, she doesn't care. She says it's a pity to kill the pretty singing birds, but the naughty sparrows and mice and rats I may do what I like with. So now, Miss Grey, you see it is not wicked." "I still think it is, Tom, and perhaps your papa and mamma would think so too if they thought much about it." "However," I internally added, "they may say what they please, but I am determined you shall do nothing of the kind as long as I have power to prevent it." So she's determined to reform the boy and to give him some education, not just knowledge of languages, history, etc., but knowledge of the world, what is good, what is bad. He next took me across the lawn to see his mole traps, and then into the stackyard to see his weasel traps, one of which, to his great joy, contained a dead weasel, and then into the stable to see, not the fine carriage horses, but a little rough colt, which he informed me had been bred on purpose for him, and he was to ride it as soon as it was properly trained. So you see, the more we read about Tom, the more we realize what a terrible boy he is. He has no limits, so he's been given no restraints by his father, mother, or uncle. So he could do as he wanted to, as he wished with the poor animals. No one would say anything. On the contrary, they would even motivate him to keep doing by saying that he was a good boy. So he didn't realize that it was a wicked thing to do, to kill animals and torture animals like that. I tried to amuse the little fellow and listen to all his chatter as complacently as I could, for I thought if he had any affections at all, I would endeavor to win them, and then in time I might be able to show him the error of his ways. But I looked in vain for that generous, noble spirit his mother talked of, though I could see he was not without a certain degree of quickness and penetration when he chose to exert it. When we re-entered the house, it was nearly tea time. Master Tom told me that, as Papa was from home, he and I and Mary Ann were to have tea with Mamma for a treat, for on such occasions she always dined at luncheon time with them instead of at 6 o'clock. Soon after tea, Mary Ann went to bed, but Tom favored us with his company and conversation till 8. After he was gone, Mrs. Bloomfield further enlightened me on the subject of her children's dispositions and acquirements, and on what they were to learn and how they were to be managed, and cautioned me to mention their defects to no one but herself. My mother had warned me before to mention them as little as possible to her, for people did not like to be told of their children's faults, and so I concluded I was to keep silence on them altogether. About 9:30, Mrs. Bloomfield invited me to partake a frugal supper of cold meat and bread. I was glad when that was over, and she took her bedroom candlestick and retired to rest. For though I wished to be pleased with her, her company was extremely irksome to me, and I could not help feeling that she was cold, grave, and forbidding, the very opposite of the kind, warm-hearted matron my hopes had depicted her to be. And that's the end of chapter 1. So we read about Agnes's first impressions of Wellwood Mansion, Mrs. Bloomfield, and the children. So the dreary weather that welcomed her to Wellwood was indeed a sign, right? Her welcoming at Wellwood was cold. Mrs. Bloomfield is a cold woman who thinks well of her children, but they are terrible children. They have very little knowledge, little education, little knowledge of the world. And above all, and worst of all, Master Tom. So Master is how you refer to a boy when he's not old enough yet to be called Mr. So then you would call him Master. And Master Tom, the worst of all the children, who got satisfaction, pleasure out of killing animals, torturing animals, and has a very bad disposition, wants to boss the governess around. So this is her new home. The prospects are not very good, right? But we'll keep going. Let's see what else happens in her journey. So let's read chapter 3, a few more lessons. I rose next morning with a feeling of hopeful exhilaration in spite of the disappointment already experienced. But I found the dressing of Mary Ann was no light matter, as her abundant hair was to be smeared with pomade, plaited in the 3 long tails, and tied with bows of ribbon, a task my unaccustomed fingers found great difficulty in performing. She told me her nurse could do it in half the time, and by keeping up a constant fidget of impatience, contrived to render me still longer. When all was done, we went into the schoolroom, where I met my other pupil and chatted with the two till it was time to go down to breakfast. That meal being concluded, and a few civil words having been exchanged with Mrs. Bloomfield, we repaired to the schoolroom again and commenced the business of the day. So it's her second day there. So the previous day she had just arrived. Right the following day, she starts her work as the governess. Mary Ann sleeps in her room, and she has to wash her, change her, do her hair, which is quite more challenging than she thought it would. And it's nice to see what the daily life of a governess would be like in the Victorian era. This is a window into the past. This is fantastic, right? So she would go to the schoolroom to talk to the kids. And when breakfast was ready, they would go down to have breakfast. And then after breakfast was concluded, they would return to the schoolroom to begin the day, to begin the studies. I found my pupils very backward indeed. But Tom, though averse to every species of mental exertion, was not without abilities. Mary Ann could scarcely read a word, and was so careless and inattentive that I could hardly get on with her at all. So she's 6 years old, and she can barely read at all. However, by dint of great labor and patience, I managed to get something done in the course of the morning, and then accompanied my young charge out into the garden and adjacent grounds for a little recreation before dinner. There we got along tolerably tolerably together, except that I found they had no notion of going with me. I must go with them, wherever they chose to lead me. I must run, walk, or stand exactly as it suited their fancy. This, I thought, was reversing the order of things, and I found doubly disagreeable, as on this as well as subsequent occasions, they seemed to prefer the dirtiest places and the most dismal occupations. So you see how she's being bossed around by the kids. She does not have control over the kids. She's trying, but it is quite difficult, and they find it quite easy to manipulate and control her. But there was no remedy. Either I must follow them or keep entirely apart from them, and thus appear neglectful of my charge. Today they manifested a particular attachment to a well at the bottom of the lawn, where they persisted in dabbling with sticks and pebbles for above half an hour. I was in constant fear that their mother would see them from the window and blame me for allowing them thus to draggle their clothes and wet their feet and hands instead of taking exercise. But no arguments, commands, or entreaties could draw them away. If she did not see them, someone else did. A gentleman on horseback had entered the gate and was proceeding up the road. At the distance of a few paces from us, he paused, and calling to the children in a waspish, penetrating tone, bade them keep out of that water. Miss Grey, said he, I suppose it is Miss Grey. I am surprised that you should allow them to dirty their clothes in that manner. Don't you see how Miss Bloomfield has soiled her frock, and that Master Bloomfield's socks are quite wet, and both of them without gloves? Dear, dear, let me request that in future you will keep them decent at least. So saying, he turned away and continued his ride up to the house. This was Mr. Bloomfield. I was surprised that he should nominate his children Master and Miss Bloomfield, and still more so that he should speak so uncivilly to me, their governess, and a perfect stranger to himself. So she's not being taken seriously, right? Her work is not being taken seriously, and Mr. Bloomfield talks to her in a very uncivil manner. Didn't even introduce himself, and at that moment makes it clear to her that he thinks she's not doing her work properly. Presently the bell rung to summon us in. I dined with the children at 1, while he and his lady took their luncheon at the same table. His conduct there did not greatly raise him in my estimation. He was a man of ordinary stature, rather below than above, and rather thin than stout, apparently between 30 and 40 years of age. He had a large mouth, pale dingy complexion, milky blue eyes, and hair the color of a hempen cord. There was a roast leg of mutton before him. He helped Mrs. Bloomfield, the children, and me, desiring me to cut up the children's meat. Then, after twisting about the mutton in various directions and eyeing it from different points, he pronounced it not fit to be eaten and called for the cold beef. So he asks her to cut the meat for the children. So she's doing much more than was expected from a governess, right? She's kind of governess and maid to the children. And he looks at the meat, at the mutton meat, and says it's not to be eaten. What is the matter with the mutton, my dear? Asked his maid, his wife. It is quite overdone. Don't you taste, Mrs. Bloomfield, that all the goodness is roasted out of it? And can't you see that all that nice red gravy is completely dried away? Well, I think the beef will suit you. The beef was set before him, and he began to carve, but with the most rueful expression of discontent. What is the matter with the beef, Mr. Bloomfield? I'm sure I thought it was very nice. And so it was very nice. A nicer joint could not be, but it is quite spoiled, replied he dolefully. How so? How so? Why, don't you see how it is cut? Dear, dear, it is quite shocking. They must have cut it wrong in the kitchen then, for I'm sure I carved it quite properly here yesterday. No doubt they cut it wrong in the kitchen, the savages. Dear, dear, did ever anyone see such a fine piece of beef so completely ruined? But remember that in future, when a decent dish leaves this table, they shall not touch it in the kitchen. Remember that, Mrs. Bloomfield. Notwithstanding the ruinous state of the beef, the gentleman managed to cut himself some delicate slices, part of which he ate in silence. When he next spoke, it was in a less querulous tone to ask what there was for dinner. Turkey and grouse, was the concise reply. And grouse is a type of bird. And what besides? Fish. What kind of fish? I don't know. You don't know? Cried he, looking solemnly up from his plate and suspending his knife and fork in astonishment. No, I told the cook to get some fish. I did not particularize what. Well, that beats everything. A lady professes to keep house and doesn't even know what fish is for dinner, professes to order fish and doesn't specify what. Perhaps, Mr. Bloomfield, you will order dinner yourself in the future. Nothing more was said. So you see what a terrible man Mr. Bloomfield is, always complaining, putting blame on everyone, people in the kitchen, on Mrs. Bloomfield. But I think it was quite brave of Mrs. Bloomfield to say that, excuse me, to say that Mr. Bloomfield himself could order dinner in the future. That was quite brave. Nothing else was said. And I was very glad to get out of the room with my pupils, for I never felt so ashamed and uncomfortable in my life for anything that was not my fault. You see how different the atmosphere is in this house than it was in Agnes's house, right? Where the family was happy. It was a love match between her mother and her father, which is definitely not the case between Mr. and Mrs. Bloomfield. In the afternoon, we applied to lessons again, then went out again, then had tea in the schoolroom. Then I dressed Marianne for dessert, and when she and her brother were gone down to the dining room, I took the opportunity of beginning a letter to my dear friends at home, but the children came up before I had half completed it. So she barely has time for herself, barely has time to even write a letter. At 7, I had to put Marianne to bed. Then I played with Tom till 8. When he too went, and I finished my letter and unpacked my clothes, which I had hitherto found no opportunity for doing, and finally went to bed myself. She starts very early. She needs to get Marianne out of bed and dressed, washed, dressed, give her food. And at the end of the day, has to put her to bed, and then has to play with Tom, and he only goes to bed after 8. So she works the whole day. She barely has time for herself. She has a little bit of time before she goes to bed, and that's it. But this is a very favorable specimen of a day's proceedings. Imagine that. So if this was a good day, imagine what a bad day looked like. My task of instruction and surveillance, instead of becoming easier as my charges and I got better accustomed to each other, became more arduous as their characters unfolded. The name of governess, I soon found, was a mere mockery applied to me. My pupils had no more notions of obedience than a wild, unbroken colt. The habitual fear of their father's peevish temper and the dread of the punishments he was wont to inflict when irritated kept them generally within bounds in his immediate presence. The girls, too, had some fear of their mother's anger, and the boy might occasionally be bribed to do as she bid him by the hope of reward. But I had no rewards to offer, and as for punishments, I was given to understand, the parents reserved that privilege to themselves, and yet they expected me to keep my pupils in order. Other children might be guided by the fear of anger and the desire of approbation, but neither the one nor the other had any effect upon these. Master Tom, not content with refusing to be ruled, must needs set up as ruler, and manifested a determination to keep not only his sisters, but his governess in order, by violent manual and paddle applications. And as he was a tall, strong boy of his years, this occasioned no trifling inconvenience. A few sound boxes in the ear on such occasions might have settled the matter easily enough. But as in that case he might make up some story to his mother, which she would be sure to believe, as she had such unshaken faith in his veracity, though I had already discovered it to be by no means unimpeachable, I determined to refrain from striking him even in self-defense. And in his most violent moods, my only resource was to throw him on his back and hold his hands and feet till the frenzy was somewhat abated. Now, this may seem shocking to us, but of course, things were different back then. So violence is not used in education anymore, not at all. But it was part of a child's education or growth journey in the past. So she was not allowed to punish them, right? This privilege was reserved for the parents. So she had no way, and she could not offer any reward. So she found no way to really keep them in order. What she would do when Master Tom was in a frenzy is to throw him on his back and hold his hands and feet. Can you imagine that? To the difficulty of preventing him from doing what he ought not was added that of forcing him to do what he ought. Often he would positively refuse to learn or to repeat his lessons or even to look at his book. Here again, a good birch rod might have been serviceable, but as my powers were so limited, I must make the best use of what I had. As there was no settled hours for study and play, I resolved to give my pupils a certain task, which, with moderate attention, they could perform in a short time. Until this was done, however weary I was, or however perverse they might be, nothing short of parental interference should induce me to suffer them to leave the schoolroom, even if I should sit with my chair against the door to keep them in. Patience, firmness, and perseverance, with capital letters, patience, firmness, and perseverance were my only weapons, and these I resolved to use to the utmost. So she's doing her best to control them and to reform them in a while, but they are wild children, and they've been used to having no boundaries. So I can imagine how difficult it must have been, and they are in their own environment. They are at home. Whereas she's in a strange place, right? She's the stranger in the house. So she's trying to find ways to control them, to giving them tasks and not allowing them to leave no matter what before they finish that task, which was a good idea, I think. I determined always strictly to fulfill the threats and promises I made, and to that end I must be cautious to threaten and promise nothing that I could not perform. Then I would carefully refrain from all useless irritability and indulgence of my own ill temper. When they behaved tolerably, I would be as kind and obliging as it was in my power to be, in order to make the widest possible distinction between good and bad conduct. I would reason with them too in the simplest and most effective manner. When I reproved them or refused to gratify their wishes after a glaring fault, it should be more in sorrow than in anger. Their little hymns and prayers I would make plain and clear to their understanding. When they said their prayers at night and asked pardon for their offenses, I would remind them of the sins of the past day, solemnly but in perfect kindness, to avoid raising a spirit of opposition. Penitential hymns should be said by the naughty, cheerful ones by the comparatively good, and every kind of instruction I would convey to them as much as possible by entertaining discourse, apparently with no other object than their present amusement in view. So she has developed her own system, her own plan, which is quite good. She's not allowed to use violence. Good, right? So she has found other ways, and using discourse, so speaking as much as possible, and that is quite modern if we think about it. By these means, I hoped in time both to benefit the children and to gain the approbation of their parents, and also to convince my friends at home that I was not so wanting in skill and prudence as they supposed. I knew the difficulties I had to contend with were great, but I knew, at least I believed, unremitting patience and perseverance could overcome them, and night and morning I implored divine assistance to this end. But either the children were so incorrigible, the parents so unreasonable, or myself so mistaken in my views, or so unable to carry them out, that my best intentions and most strenuous efforts seemed productive of no better result than sport to the children, dissatisfaction to their parents, and torment to myself. It's not easy, but she does not want to give up, also because she wants to prove to her family at home that she's able to do this. She's up for the challenge. The task of instruction was as arduous for the body as the mind. I had to run after my pupils, to catch them, to carry or drag them to the table, and often forcibly to hold them there till the lesson was done. Tom I frequently put into a corner, sitting myself before him in a chair, with a book which contained the little task that must be said or read before he was released in my hand. He was not strong enough to push both me and the chair away, so he would stand twisting his body and face into the most grotesque and singular contortions. Laughable, no doubt, to an unconcerned spectator, but not to me, and uttering loud yells and doleful outcries intended to represent weeping, but wholly without the accompaniment of tears. I knew this was done solely for the purpose of annoying me, and therefore, however I might inwardly tremble with impatience and irritation, I manfully strove to suppress all visible signs of molestation, and affected to sit with calm indifference, waiting till it should please him to cease his pastime and prepare for a run in the garden by casting his eye on the book and reading or repeating the few words he was required to say. Sometimes he would determine to do his writing badly, and I had to hold his hand to prevent him from purposely blotting or disfiguring the paper. Frequently I threatened that if he did not do better, he should have another line. Then he would stubbornly refuse to write this line, and I, to save my word, had finally to resort to the expedient of holding his fingers upon the pen and forcibly drawing his hand up and down till, in spite of his resistance, the line was in some sort completed. Can you imagine that? Yet Tom was by no means the most unmanageable of my pupils. Sometimes, to my great joy, he would have the sense to see that his wisest policy was to finish his tasks and go out and amuse himself till I and his sisters came to join him, which frequently was not at all, for Mary Ann seldom followed his example in this particular. She apparently preferred rolling on the floor to any other amusement. Down she would drop like a leaden weight, and when I, with great difficulty, had succeeded in rooting her thence, I had still to hold her up with one arm, while with the other I held the book from which she was to read or spell her lesson. As the dead weight of the big girl of 6 became too heavy for one arm to bear, I transferred it to the other. Or if both were weary of the burden, I carried her into a corner and told her she might come out when she should find the use of her feet and stand up. But she generally preferred lying there like a log till dinner or tea time, when, as I could not deprive her of her meals, she must be liberated, and would come crawling out with a grin of triumph on her round red face. What terrible kids! Often she would stubbornly refuse to pronounce some particular word in her lesson, and I now regret the lost labor I have had in striving to conquer her obstinacy. If I had passed it over as a matter of no consequence, it would have been better for both parties than vainly striving to overcome it as I did. But I thought it my absolute duty to crush this vicious tendency in the bud, and so it was if I could have done it. And had my powers been less limited, I might have enforced obedience. But as it was but a trial of strength between her and me, in which she generally came off victorious, and every victory served to encourage and strengthen her for future contest. In vain I argued, coaxed, entreated, threatened, scolded. In vain I kept her in from play, or, if obliged to take her out, refused to play with her or to speak kindly or have anything to do with her. In vain I tried to set before her the advantages of doing as she was bid, and being loved and kindly treated in consequence, and the disadvantages of persisting in her absurd perversity. Sometimes when she asked me to do something for her, I would answer, "Yes, I will, Mary Ann, and if you will only say that word." Come, you'd better say it at once and have no more trouble about it. No. Then, of course, I can do nothing for you. With me at her age or under, neglect and disgrace were the most dreadful of punishments, but on her they made no impression. Sometimes, exasperated to the utmost pitch, I would shake her violently by the shoulders, or pull her long hair, or put her in the corner, for which she punished me with loud, shrill, piercing screams that went through my head like a knife. She knew I hated this, and when she had shrieked her utmost, would look into my face with an air of vindictive satisfaction, exclaiming, "Now then, that's for you," and then shriek again and again till I was forced to stop my ears. Often these dreadful cries would bring Mrs. Bloomfield up to inquire what was the matter. "Mary Ann is a naughty girl, ma'am." "But what are these shocking screams?" "She's screaming in a passion." "I never heard such a dreadful noise. You might be killing her. Why is she not out with her brother?" "I cannot get her to finish her lessons." "But Mary Ann must be a good girl and finish her lessons." This was bluntly spoken to the child, and I hope I shall never hear such terrible cries again. And fixing her cold, stony eyes upon me with a look that could not be mistaken, she would shut the door and walk away. Sometimes I would try to take the little obstinate creature by surprise, and casually ask her the word while she was thinking of something else. Frequently she would begin to say it, and then suddenly check herself, with a provoking look that seemed to say, "Ah, I'm too sharp for you. You shan't trick it out of me either." On another occasion I pretended to forget the whole affair, and talked and played with her as usual till night, when I put her to bed. Then bending over her while she lay all smiles and good humor, just before departing, I said as cheerfully and kindly as before, "Now, Mary Ann, just tell me that word before I kiss you good night. You are a good girl now, and of course you will say it." "No, I won't." "Then I can't kiss you." "Well, I don't care." In vain I expressed my sorrow. In vain I lingered for some symptom of contrition. She really didn't care. And I left her alone and in darkness, wondering most of all at this last proof of insensate stubbornness. In my childhood, I could not imagine a more afflictive punishment than for my mother to refuse to kiss me at night. The very idea was terrible. More than the idea I never felt, for happily I never committed a crime that was deemed worthy of such a penalty. But once, I remember, for some transgression of my sister's, our mother thought proper to inflict it upon her. What she felt I cannot tell, but my sympathetic tears and suffering for her sake I shall not soon forget. Another troublesome trait in Mary Ann was her incorrigible propensity to keep running into the nursery to play with her little sisters and the nurse. This was natural enough, but as it was against her mother's expressed desire, I, of course, forbade her to do so, and did my utmost to keep her with me, but that only increased her relish for the nursery, and the more I strove to keep her out of it, the oftener she went, and the longer she stayed, to the great dissatisfaction of Mrs. Bloomfield, who I well knew would impute all the blame of the matter to me. Another of my trials was the dressing in the morning. At one time she would not be washed. At another she would not be dressed, unless she might wear some particular frock that I knew her mother would not like her to have. At another she would scream and run away if I attempted to touch her hair. So that frequently when, after much trouble and toil, I had at length succeeded in bringing her down, the breakfast was nearly half over, and black looks from mamma and testy observations from papa, spoken at me, if not to me, were sure to be my meed. For few things irritated the latter so much as want of punctuality at meal times. Then, among the minor annoyances, was my inability to satisfy Mrs. Bloomfield with her daughter's dress, and the child's hair was never fit to be seen. Sometimes, as a powerful reproach to me, she would perform the office of tirewoman herself, and then complain bitterly of the trouble it gave her. When little Fanny came into the schoolroom, so when she turned 4, I hoped she would be mild and inoffensive at least, but a few days, if not a few hours, sufficed to destroy the illusion. I found her a mischievous, intractable little creature given up to falsehood and deception. Young as she was, and alarmingly fond of exercising her two favorite weapons of offense and defense, that of spitting in the faces of those who incurred her displeasure, and bellowing like a bull when her unreasonable desires were not gratified. As she generally was pretty quiet in her parents' presence, and they were impressed with the notion of her being a remarkably gentle child, her falsehoods were readily believed, and her loud uproars led them to suspect harsh and injudicious treatment on my part. And when at length her bad disposition became manifest, even to their prejudiced eyes, I felt that the whole was attributed to me. "What a naughty girl Fanny is getting," Mrs. Bloomfield would say to her spouse. "Don't you observe, my dear, how she is altered since she entered the schoolroom? She will soon be as bad as the other two, and I'm sorry to say they have quite deteriorated of late." "You may say that," was the answer. "I've been thinking that same myself. I thought when we got them a governess they'd improve, but instead of that they got worse and worse. I don't know how it is with their learning, but their habits, I know, make no sort of improvement. They get rougher and dirtier and more unseemly every day." I knew this was all pointed at me, and this and all similar innuendos affected me far more deeply than any open accusations would have done. For against the latter I should have been roused to speak in my own defense. Now I judged it my wisest plan to subdue every resentful impulse, suppress every sensitive shrinking, and go on perseveringly doing my best. For irksome as my situation was, I earnestly wished to retain it. I thought if I could struggle on with unremitting firmness and integrity, the children would in time become more humanized. Every month would contribute to make them some little wiser and consequently more manageable. For a child of 9 or 10, as frantic and ungovernable as these at 6 and 7 would be a maniac. I flattered myself I was benefiting my parents and sister by my continuance here. For small as the salary was, I still was earning something, and with strict economy, I could easily manage to have something to spare for them if they would favor me by taking it. Then it was by my own will that I had got the place. I had brought all this tribulation on myself, and I was determined to bear it. Nay, more than that, I did not even regret the step I had taken, and I longed to show my friends that even now I was competent to undertake the charge, and able to acquit myself honorably to the end. And if ever I felt it degrading to submit so quietly or intolerable to toil so constantly, I would turn towards my home and say within myself, "They may crush, but they shall not subdue me. 'Tis of thee that I think, not of them." And this is a quote. Let's see the footnote on number 5. This is from Lord Byron's Stanzas to Augusta. "They may crush, but they shall not subdue me. It is of thee that I think, not of them." So she's not concerned with the Bloomfields. She's concerned with her own family, and that is what keeps her going. About Christmas, I was allowed a visit home, but only for a fortnight's duration. "For," said Mrs. Bloomfield, "I thought, as you had seen your friends so lately, you would not care for a longer stay." I left her to think so still, but she little knew how long, how wearisome those 14 weeks of absence had been to me, how intensely I had longed for my holidays, how greatly I was disappointed at their curtailment. Yet she was not to blame in this. I had never told her my feelings, and she could not be expected to divine them. I had not been with her a full term, and she was justified in not allowing me a full vacation. And that is the end of chapter 3. So now we get a good idea of how things are for Agnes Grey at the Bloomfields. The children are terrible, the parents are terrible, but she is determined to stay for the sake of her own family, so to be able to help the family at home. And deep inside, she has the confidence that although it's hard, it's really hard, harder than she had expected, she will, with persistence, faith, perseverance, she will be able to reform these children a little bit every day. That is her hope. We'll see how things carry on next time in our session number 3, in which we'll read together chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4 is called The Grandmama, and chapter 5 is called The Uncle. So there's a lot to discover still. We're just in the beginning of this journey. So if you have enjoyed this session, please like the video or the episode if you're listening to the podcast. Leave a comment, share it with your friends. Let's spread the love and let's make books and culture known to all book lovers around the world. Thank you so much for joining me in this literary adventure. If you would like to go on another literary adventure with me, check out the available courses and workshops at booksandculture.club. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.